This
Allow me.
conference will now be recorded.
All right. Thank you very much, and much appreciated, as I said, for the opportunity. So we are the NRCS, and we're going to speak about the National Building Regulation Building Standards Act, Act 103 of 1977. Typical legislative writing, the title of the act is to provide for the promotion of uniformity in the law relating to the erection of buildings in the area of jurisdiction of local authorities by prescribing building standards and for matters connected therewith. Now, if any one of you understand what I've just quickly read there, I think you're a Superman. So we'll get to that as we get further down the evening. So our topic is what architects need to know about the law. And what we are going to discuss tonight is who and what is the NRCS, why do we need a building permit system, Act regulations deemed to satisfy the regulation standards, specifically Act regulations, National Standard 10400. And then I'm going to touch on a framework for self-certification, discuss a little bit further self-certification by the built environment professionals such as architects, ask the question, are built environment professionals trained to self-certify? And then lastly, can government move from a gatekeeper to an auditor and an educator? So we're going to deal with a new concept, which is flying within the international built environment. And this is called self-certifying. And the definition, therefore, is the ability for a built environment practitioner, stroke architect, to sign off his own or her own building plans. This has become known to be self-certifying or professional certification. This means that these accredited professionals can certify building applications that are filed with the building control department as being compliant and applicable with the law, and thus approving the building application on behalf of the local authority. So who are we and what is the NRCS? We National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications. We're a public entity responsible to the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition for administering technical regulations. And we consist out of a couple of departments: automotive, electrical, technical, and gaming, chemical, mechanical, and materials, food industries, and we also administer the Trade Metrology Act. Now, all of those are different areas of jurisdiction, and I'm not going to go into that in much detail because that'll just take up our time. But the main thing for us here is that we also are regulated, or the regulators of the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act. Our minister who deals with it is the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, and he's given us the mandate to administer technical regulations in the interest of public safety and health for environmental protection. So why do we need a building code or a national building regulation? First and foremost, the Tower of Babel that is described in the Bible talks about the Code of Hammurabi. And this is the oldest discovered legal system. And that law says if a builder build a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built fall and kill its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Quite clear, tooth for a tooth, eye for an eye. This is actually a 3-page document, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But in essence, it is how we regulate the building industry. So if we go back to the title of this act, provide for the promotion of uniformity in the law, erection of buildings in the jurisdiction of local authorities, or prescribing building standards. So the first one is uniformity in law. So everybody in the whole country, when we start building, is on the same page. We all adhere to the same piece of legislation, and we make sure that the playing fields are uniform when we start working in that environment. It has got to do with the erection of buildings. We're not interested in dams, railway lines, infrastructure. It is focused on the building sector. It falls within the jurisdiction of local authorities. So taking into account, we've got national government who creates the National Building Regulation Building Standards Act, but the administrators of this act lies within the local authorities. So each and every one of the 276 odd local authorities in South Africa, each has a element that deals with this act. And then the way we do that is by prescribing building standards. And of course, those building standards are developed by the SABS for us. So the aim of this legislation is to ensure that all buildings perform in a manner that will ensure health, safety, structural stability, and environmental sustainability. So if we want to put this in a mind map, maybe this is what we have. We've got an owner. This owner wants a house. The only way that the owner can get the house, he needs to have a building plan prepared for him. We say that all buildings start their life on paper. And equally in this case, the owner needs to get a building plan done. The way that he does that, he employs building environment practitioners, architects, engineers, quantity surveyors to develop the drawings for him. But seeing that all of the technical information is provided on the drawing, that drawing is also available for us to scrutinize and to determine if that building will satisfy the requirements of the National Building Regulation Building Standards Act. So that building plan will be then submitted to the local authority, where the building control officer will scrutinize that building application. That same building application, you must also realize, is the basis for the information given to the construction industry, people like property developers, main contractors, bondholders, and even the NHBRC, who then scrutinize those building plans for their own reasons. When we look at the building plan submission to the local authority, we go through those four main things: uniformity in the law, erection of buildings, local authority, and building standards. There is a statutory appointed building control officer appointed within each and every local authority. It is the building control officer's function to make sure that he advises the local authority on building matters. So in fact, he is your agent who comes from the same environment that we also come from, and he is supposed to look after the interests of the building industry at local authority level. He will then scrutinize the building plan through the sieve of the National Building Regulations. Once he's approved the building, then the opportunity exists for construction to commence. The construction is then completed by all of the various role players within the built environment up to the stage when the building is complete. At that stage, the building control officer will issue an occupancy certificate. And that's the end of our legislative environment. The building will only enter again into the process when a new building plan is submitted to the local authority. So if we look at how our system is put together, we're a constitutional democracy. So we've got the state, Parliament as the legislator. Parliament creates these laws. And in our case, it was created in 1977. Parliament automatically doesn't have the time to maintain and look after the act. And that act is then, in our case, given to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition to administer such act. The act primarily focuses on life protection and aims to ensure that all buildings are health, safety, structural, stable, and environmentally sustainable. The Parliament delegates the act to the minister, but the minister has then, in terms of Section 70 of that act, the right to develop regulations to expand on the requirements of the act. And the regulations in our case have been given to the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications to assist the minister in developing those regulations. You must understand the act and the regulation form part of the legislative requirements of the National Building Regulations. But in our case, we also have a unique situation whereby the minister incorporates objective standards as technical standards into the building legislation. This is done by incorporating SANS 10400 as subsidiary legislation. Now, this is what we call the deemed to satisfy rules, and they are written as a mirror image to satisfy the requirements laid down in the regulations, which are the functional requirements. And in that case, the SABS is tasked to perform that function. So if you read the Act, it says it's the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act. And that then suggests that the Act, the regulations, and the standards are contained in one document. That is not the fact, as there are three separate documents contained in our building law. There's the Act, there's a set of regulations, and then we have a suite of documents called the South African National Standards, specifically SANS 10400, and which consists out of 23 different chapters. The Act is the empowering legislation. The regulations are compulsory, which means that thou shalt obey this law. And the SANS 10400 are rules and are not always compulsory. They are only compulsory when they are used as a solution to satisfy the regulations. But it's not the only solution. We have other solutions, such as a rational design done by a competent person, and also a Agrima certificate issued that states that the building component is fit for purpose. So if we must understand, our architectural profession unfortunately lacks training in the National Building Regulation Building Standards Act. I've been requested to present a 2-hour lecture to the University of Pretoria for their professional practice students that are finishing this year. That's the exposure that the architects receive when they start with their training. Other universities, UCT has got a little bit bigger curriculum to deal with it. But in essence, we are surely lacking in understanding of the National Building Regulation Building Standards Act. You must understand, if you are playing in this field called architecture and you don't know the rules of the game, you cannot partake in the game. So you need to upskill your knowledge when it comes to at least the Act, but the meat of the whole document would be the regulations, because that's where the functional requirements are tied down. The SANS 10400, however, are adding information, so it's impossible to learn all of the requirements or the solutions provided by SANS 10400. So in essence, coming back to the Act, the 28 sections of the Act shown here starts off with the definition section, application of the Act, where it is applicable, and then, very important, duties of draftsmen of plans, specifications, documents, and diagrams. That's where it gives you all of the legislative requirements, what our industry is based on. And Section 4 talks about the approval of the local authorities in respect of erection of buildings. As I said, the building control officer is decreed by this Act to be appointed by each and every local authority. It also gives the functions of that building control officer, and then a section approval of local authorities in respect of these buildings. I'm not going to read through all of them. As you can clearly see, they are critically important, and you need to have a sound knowledge of most of these elements to be able to perform or to practice in the architecture profession. Important, however, to point out Section 9, which was a section that allowed for an appeal against decisions of local authorities. Unfortunately, that has been found to be unconstitutional. So at this stage, Section 9 is no longer applicable within our legislation. So in essence, Section 4 of the Act requires that no person shall, without the prior approval in writing of the local authority in question, erect any building in respects of which plans and specifications are to be drawn and submitted in terms of this Act. And then Section 7 of the same Act, two aspects to it. The first one says, when the local authority considered a recommendation is satisfied that it complies, it shall grant its approval. It's not a debate. If your building plan satisfies the regulations, then the local authority has to approve your application. On the other side, when the local authority is satisfied that it does not comply, it shall refuse the application. Quite clear, without ambiguity. You should also understand that there's many other acts that deals with the built environment. And I'm not going to read through them, but that's what makes life difficult for all of us in this field, because there's so many hoops to jump through, and each and every one of these chaps see that the National Building Regulation is good legislation, and therefore attaches another piece of requirement onto our act to make it to assist them in their application. So if we look at the regulations, as I said, Section 17 of the Act allows the minister to create regulations. And in essence, the regulation starts off with a AZ1, AZ2, AZ3. So those are sort of administrative processes putting that in place. Which is of importance to us at this stage is Regulation AZ4, and that tells you how we comply with the National Building Regulations. And I've already touched on that, whereby it said you either follow SANS 10400 or you appoint a professional person who is competent to perform a rational design, or you go through a process of getting Agrima South Africa to certify that the building product or system that you want to use is fit for purpose. And then critically, ladies and gentlemen, Part A, administration, is the section that all architects or architectural practitioners has to become familiar with. That tells you in total what and how the legislation is supposed to fit together. And then the rest of the regulations up to XA is made up of the main components of a building. So if we look at the Act we said is the empowering part, and the empowering part actually says that the buildings has to be regulated. It doesn't tell you how, it just gives the empowering part of it. It has to be regulated. But it doesn't give you the meat to that. So the regulations expands on the Act, and if we look at the regulation H, which is foundations, that regulation will state that the foundation must be strong enough to carry the loads imposed on it. So that's the functional requirement, and it's quite clear that if we want to regulate buildings and we talk about foundations, that foundation's only work is to be strong enough to carry the building and the weight and the loads imposed on it. Doesn't tell you how it should be done. It gives you the functional requirements, legislative requirement that needs to be looked at. And then to satisfy the regulations, we are then forced, I need to recap here. I've lost my own thought trail. I'll come back to the solution to the regulation, but wanting to go back and highlight the administrative part thereof. The administrative part ties up us as the professions by stating that this regulation applies to all persons designing, planning, and the supervision of the erection of any building, structure, or the performance of any function in terms of these regulations, that person undertaking such work is required to be registered in terms of the architectural profession, the engineering profession, natural science professions, or technical surveyor's profession. So it ties into this act the professional categories within the built environment. So that's why I constantly say to the practice committee at SACAP and SIA, chaps, you must understand this is your legislation. It is the legislation that has been provided to look after our profession, and we should not neglect it going forward. All right, so there are the 23 national regulations. I just quickly showed you the A part, but if you can see, A runs into 825. And ladies and gentlemen, I can't stress enough the necessity for you to really be on top of these regulations, because these are the functional requirements to which all of your buildings has to comply with. And these are just the basic, like this foundation must be strong enough to carry the loads on it. If you were not aware of that, you will most probably have problems in designing your buildings. Well, I missed out on the slide for the South African national standards. But okay, so our next question would be, could we move government from a gatekeeper, which is currently what we're doing, is we are actually marking all of the building applications submitted to local authorities. So we expect the building control officer sitting at a local authority to sit with a big red pencil, and you give him the building plan. He's supposed to know all of the regulations and also the SANS 10400 documents, and he goes through your submitted document and checks if it complies. Right tick, oh, sorry, cross, there's something wrong here. And I don't think that's where we are supposed to be. So when we develop the SANS 10400 solutions, they are specialist solutions provided by nominated captains of industry. So we have architects, we have engineers, we have quantity surveyors on the committees that deal with the National Building Regulation and Building Standards Act, specifically SANS 10400 subsidiary legislation. But remember, these standards have to satisfy the regulation. So if we talk about the foundation part of it, foundation says strong enough. The SANS 10400 part H will say, for the standard to satisfy the regulation, these couple of items should be in place. First and foremost, the soil should be of good quality, and then a 600 wide, 200 thick, 10 MPa strip foundation, 450 below natural ground level will satisfy the regulations requirements. So it provides you with a full recipe of solving the foundation must be strong enough regulation requirement. So we have captains of industry sitting at SABS, and they provide SANS 10400 principles for part A, part B, C, D, E, F, right down to XA. So you have a mirror image of the regulations, each and every one of them providing a solution to the functional requirement. These are committees under the auspices of TC60. Now, TC60 doesn't mean much to us, but TC60 is, again, a direct mirror image of the international committee who sits in Europe that deals with building environments. So they also call TC60s, and they have this panel of people sitting around the table discussing and giving solutions to the requirements that are laid down by the regulations. Each and every technical expert is represented by industry bodies. So it's not individuals sitting there, it is people who are recognized by the industry as having the contextual knowledge and are asked to voluntarily sit on these committees and provide us with their technical expertise. But when we start looking at where we want to go, we have a section SANS 10400 Part C that deals with dimensions. And in dimensions, it only describes two-dimensional drawings and how those should be done. But the rest of the world is carrying on, and we in South Africa are lagging behind in that electronics are becoming much more prevalent within the built environment. And I actually want to come to this team of people and start saying is that start dreaming with us so that we can start changing from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, and even robotics helping us in regulating the building industry. So instead of just having a bunch of people describing how you must sharpen your pencils, we must need to start dreaming for system engineering and your field of building information management modeling, so that we can add into the scrutineering process moving forward. It is not impossible, and in fact many countries in the rest of the world has a compliance mechanism which is measured by putting the rules within a program which would then scrutinize your electronic document for you. Understand that by asking the local authority to sit there with a red pencil, going through a printed out document that you have created that has intelligence in it is actually working backwards. Why not use the intelligence that is already embedded within your document and to compare that to the regulations that are available and that looks after the functional requirements of your building. It is quite possible to integrate within your software building codes, and that these building codes will, as you draw, automatically ensure that your building conforms to national norms and standards. And if you, for instance, escape route and you want to create the escape route and it doesn't comply with the minimum width of it, the program can come in and say to you, you can't have that. You have to increase the width or create a different escape route, either which way is the way you go. Plan submissions could be scrutinized three-dimensionally before buildings are even constructed. So we can go through the whole process. And at the end of the day, we can compare it with other electronics, photogrammetry, and we can create 3D models virtually by the technology that is available. All of these technologies we have to start using to scrutinize and get the building permitting system streamlined. So are we trained to do that? Unfortunately, no. These are the qualifications of our building control officers. They've got a minimum qualifications of a 3-year tertiary education in the following building disciplines: civil engineering, structural engineering, architecture, building management, building science, building survey, or quantity survey. So as I said earlier, they are your representatives at local authority. If you look at the national qualification frameworks, they're coming in at an NQF level 6, which is a minimum level of diploma. But you must also understand that there are 276 local authorities out there, and some of them are very, very small. And because of that, the National Building Regulation can only specify minimum qualifications. So if it's a minimum qualification, it's actually a very high qualification if you consider it in the rest of the country. But in places like Cape Town, for instance, although that NQF level 6 is the entry level, due to the fact that the building control officer has a very large managerial component, City of Johannesburg, staff complement 156. City of Cape Town, staff complement 124. Now, any manager who deals with 124 plus is a serious manager in terms of risk and competence. And therefore, the building control officer, the previous building control officer, Johannesburg, had an NQF level 9 qualification to deal with the built environment. And so where we come from with an NQF level 8, maybe an NQF level 9, we do not have exposure of the national building regulation and the requirements and the legislative background around the scrutinizing of building plans to be able to just automatically start with scrutinizing such. So we have created academic qualifications. We've got the local government sector, CETA. They've sponsored such qualification. We got the Equality Council for the Trade of Occupation to develop education for us. South African Council for the Architecture Profession is the quality partner, so they are looking after making sure that all of their interests are covered. And SAQA is in the process of having that qualification approved. It's an additional NQF level 6 qualification. So in spite of the fact that you could have a degree, you will also require to achieve additional information and education to be able to be a self-certified practitioner. The building control officers will in the future be professionally registered, and you can see that their experience tables and qualifications are listed here below, starting off from a building inspector, which is your lowest level, up to a chartered building surveyor or a building control officer, being in level 8 qualification. So what we are hoping to achieve is to have your building application electronically scrutinized and automatically self-certified, thus approving a building application with the local authority. We have serious problems when we start looking at the local authorities. Our skills are dwindling. The capacity of the people that we have available, the numbers we have, all of them are problematic. And it makes logical sense to start talking self-certification to unlock the vast blockages municipalities faced. We must therefore rouse ourselves to action and busy ourselves with interests that are good, as often as we are in the grasp of an uncontrollable sluggishness. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thanks, Rudolph. Yeah, let's hop over to questions now. If anybody has any questions, you are welcome to send them on the group, on the chat box. Just type in something over here. And once you have sent out the question, I'll just read it out. Chat box does not reflect on the recording. So Rudolph, Johnsley was asking whether you are aware of any softwares or the names of any softwares that can be used to help analyze the virtual models for compliance with building regulations.
I'm not aware of any. I haven't had any dealings with it. I'm aware of Singapore having made it mandatory to submit all building applications in BIM. Due to the fact that they are scrutinizing such with software. What the products are, I'm not aware of. I was privy to a presentation some 8-10 years ago of a gentleman from the UK who came in and presented the possibility of having a building plan scrutinized electronically. I think the national building regulations of each and every country are quite unique, and therefore we'll have to get local content, local specialists involved. And in South Africa, I am not aware of any software company or developers that have expressed interest in developing something like this. There's money to be made. There's good money to be made. And interested in such. I mean, I know of a senior technologist who has started writing a book and just sketching out what each and every requirement is. Now that's fantastic work, but it's really going back to the Middle Ages, because the technical manner in which our documents are written are so technical that we need to have pictures to understand them, like a comic book. And we should have the technology talking to it. So please, ladies and gentlemen, if you're at all interested, move in that direction. There's a good future in that environment. I must, however, also say that we've got a 1977 Vintage Act. We have been trying to convince our minister since 2013 to change and rewrite the act. And we've been receiving promises every now and then that we will do that shortly. And if we start with the work now, it might be that we change the act, and then a lot of the items will be fruitless expenditure. But I just need to get your buy-in to start building and thinking in that direction. Because as I said, if you want the qualifications to do self-certification, it's going to be a lengthy road, but you can create within your software those checks and balances already. And then the big picture would be, once you've completed your document, your software would be able to certify that your building complies to the law. And that then becomes a submission added to your municipal submission to say, here's the certificate from the software that says it complies. And that will then alleviate standing in a long queue waiting for an approval.
Thank you. Yeah, I know where Archicad had an add-on several years back for the smart, the SANS XA, and that used to work. Although now that the code is adjusted slightly, they have had to recode the software so that it would still certify it again. I'm not too sure whether there's anything in the pipeline for building regulations, especially here in South Africa. Anyway, next question from Donnie Stradham. When do you expect self-certification to be applied?
There's a couple of challenges. If you look at the new SANS 10400 Part A that was published in end of last year, beginning of this year, we have opened the door, but unfortunately we have still some regulatory constricting processes that needs to be solved, and that can only come from the minister. I must, however, state that in both 2019 and 2022, our president in the State of the Nation address highlighted the fact that red tape needs to be looked at, and specifically described the building permitting system as one of the big bottlenecks. So at least we are on the minister's or the president's table, and with the World Bank, we have meetings and working groups in between with representatives of the president's office, specifically driving towards getting self-certification done. Our biggest challenge in getting there is the fact that nobody in the architectural profession has the embedded knowledge to self-certify. If we do not have educational knowledge presented at tertiary level describing how the National Building Regulation works and the like, we cannot give it to the architects, because the architects wouldn't even know what they're certifying. They wouldn't even know what risk they are taking. In fact, we compiled a list of court cases directly influenced by or changing the national building regulation, and it's in the region of 128, if I remember correctly, 135 court cases that has changed the way that we operate in the national building regulations. Now, that forms part of the curriculum for the building control officers, and your architects cannot try and do self-certification without having that embedded knowledge as well. So from our side, we are pushing very hard to change the regulations so that self-certification can become a possibility. The architect's challenge is that they don't have the knowledge to be able to do so.
Thank you. Alette asks, what can an architect do when the council refuses to approve a building plan due to their wrong interpretation of the law?
All right, a sensitive item. Previously, we had the review board, and the review board's function was specifically to allow an applicant who felt aggrieved by the decision of the local authority not to approve the building plan to approach the review board, and the review board would then act as a intermediate here, both of sides of the argument, and then made a technical decision by interpreting what the SAN standard or the regulation stated. However, we have now a new constitution, and the constitution has given the administration to the local authorities, and the local authorities have autonomy in making decisions. And the fact that a local authority makes an approval or refuses a application on faulty interpretation, the Constitutional Court said no, it is the right of the local authority to make that decision. And it is up to the individual or the applicant to take the local authority to task by taking them to a higher court. And the court will then decide on the interpretation thereof. The review board is no longer available. Very problematic for us at this stage. I must say in that it has now placed the local authorities in a position whereby they are blackmailing the building industry. But the Constitutional Court had made the ruling, and we are stuck with that. We are working in a process whereby when we change the Act, because remember the review board was an item within the Act, so we'll have to change the Act. When we change the Act, we will bring in a process whereby we allow the municipal manager to approach us for assisting him in allowing additional information to help him interpret such technical information. But that's way down the line. That's many years from where we are sitting now.
Thank you. Gert was asking what requirements for software to be recognized. So what are the requirements for software to be recognized by the NRCS?
Well, I think the main first item should be is to develop such which then can systematically prove that each and every one of the regulations, those requirements are captured by the software. Now, not being I said to Matthew some time ago, I'm still a CADI 9.1 operator. That's when I left the architectural industry. So I have no idea how BIM fits together and how the electronics work and the protocols work within that. But in essence, you'll have to go through the regulation, starting with regulation A1 and working through them and determine that do your protocols protect the requirements laid down in the regulations. That would then, once that has been proven, then automatically it's clear that we can then move into a direction to say, but this has already scrutinized in terms of the regulations, the requirements. And then the interim process is to see that as a regulation A19 application. In other words, it's the same as a design done by a competent person. So the person who uses that software will then register to the local authority as a competent person doing a rational design, providing a solution that is different from SANS 10400, and that person will take the responsibility for that self-certification. That's the thinking process behind it to move forward.
Thank you. Dennis, I'm not sure if this was a question, but I'm just going to say it nonetheless. Dennis was saying we can learn a lot from the Rwanda system that has drawings submitted in soft copy, and then you can begin the DWG format for a start and a standard submission format, and work our way upward. So I think that's more of a statement than.
And maybe just add to that, you know, most of Southern Africa use the National Building Regulation as their sort of basic documents. Kenya, for instance, has the South African National Building Regulation, Building Standards Act as their key document, but they perform it much better than we do because they've seen the importance of such document, and their government has grasped it 100%, and they are pushing it, and they're at this stage much more advanced than where we are. I might say in disgust, but that's a fact.
All right. Next, Johan Sneeman has asked, can the industry be co-owners of such a new BIM system in terms of your self-certification?
Sorry, again, the question, can the industry be co-owners of?
Such a BIM system, so a building information modeling system.
You know, what I just see is that someone or some industry needs to get involved in developing it. And that's going to be time-consuming, costly, and difficult to do. But automatically, that work has got intellectual ownership. So once that intellectual ownership exists and a product is available and it is found to be in accordance with satisfying the functional regulations, then why I don't see it as problematic for the minister or the national regulator for approving such and providing that as a tool to the industry, and that any person who uses a package, you know, I'm relating it to previously our CAD systems. You could buy symbols, for instance, and add them into your process. So this scrutinizing is a total different system, which you have to purchase, make it part of yours, but then it allows you to certify. And that also means, what I'm saying is that extra skill set that you've obtained, automatically there's money involved. So you should be able to be remunerated for having that service available to your clients. So I see that as a total private owned process, and assisting and making its own money on the side.
Thanks, Rudolph. Johan also added, what about the industry submitting building plans to its own private desk, thus eliminating local council?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the section in the regulation that we have to change, because the Constitution has given the function of building plan submission and building plan scrutineering and approval of such to the local authority. So you can, if the Constitution has placed it there, it's going to be very difficult to have a third party to deal with it. So we have to work out through a mechanism that you can have the software, it can certify it, but you will still have to register through the local authority, and they will have to do the approval at the end of the day. But they then reduce their risk by having a certified copy to say that this thing has already been scrutinized and it complies to the law.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It's
Last
the same
question.
as,
Yeah, sorry, you continue.
sorry, just in that, very interesting is that in South Africa, law enforcement cannot be done by a private company. In other words, America, for instance, you have your traffic officers. They get a percentage of the fines that they issue. And so a lot of good work is being done in America, whereby in South Africa, that's not allowed because you're not allowed to privatize or make financial incentives available for law enforcement officers. So the same thing applies to the building plan and the building plan approval process.
Okay, great, thanks. Last question. Has there been any discussions between different municipalities to use the same building plan application system for all of them?
Yes, definitely. So unfortunately, each and every local authority is dependent on their own budgets and their own monies being made available. You are aware of the city of Johannesburg has now gone fully electronic. Cape Town has been fully electronic for some time ago. Cape Town did it all on their own. Johannesburg has used the World Bank system, and the World Bank has made their system freely available to all of the local authorities. So I presume that they would most probably all go to the now called Johannesburg system. But it's still up to each and every local authority to approve and get buy-in from their councillors to enact the World Bank process. But the building plan process is very low on the agenda of the councillors. There's much more pressing needs than building plan applications. And as long as they're making good money from our processes, they're not really going to stir the pot as such. But I think it's important for us to be aware of that and also start requesting more and more that we want to go that route. We have, for instance, when I was in Johannesburg, we guesstimated that we had something like 8 million architectural files. Now, those files consisted out of 5 to 6 A0 size drawings, and then a whole bunch of A4 documents. So the workload just to duplicate them was such that the city could not afford to go that route. And it is growing exponentially. And the only way to solve that would be at some stage to have a cutoff point to start saying we have to go electronic and archive electronically and moving forward in such a manner. But it's not there yet.
Okay. All right, last two questions. So Gert asked, for how long must approved application, in brackets plans, be kept? And who is the ultimate keepers of them?
It's one of those unwritten items. There's nothing in the current National Building Regulation, Building Standards Act that talks about archiving. There is, however, so in other words, the local authority is legislatively not tasked to keep records. However, they do so to be able to do their law enforcement. So they have to come out and say that they don't have proof that you've got an approved building plan, and there's nothing in their records, and they then serve you with a notice to provide them with such. There is a situation whereby when you've created an archive, the Archive Act automatically kicks in to say if it's got the following functions and functionality to it, then you have to continue with that archive as per the requirements in the Archive Act. But knowing the state of local authorities and the way that they are battling to just survive, I say to everybody, please make sure you explain to all of your clients the critical importance of your approved building drawings and the occupancy certificate that goes with that approval, because that's the only record that proves that the building is a legal building. And if there's something like an earthquake, a flood, or anything to that extent, the first thing that your insurance will do is to say, where's your approved documentation? And if you cannot provide them and the local authority has somehow lost them, then you have no proof that the building existed as a legal entity. So you need to press on your client the criticality of keeping those documents in a safe somewhere, in an area which, you know, our houses is most probably our biggest investment, and we kick the bricks to say, yeah, it exists, but the documents that prove that they are legal, we don't see as valuable. And so please keep them and make sure your client keeps them. And for your client's sake, I would suggest that you keep electronic copies of those documents as long as possible. Legislatively not covered, legislatively not required.
Thank you, Rudolph. So we've kind of gone over time. I'm just going to ask the last two questions and I'm going to call it quits over there. If you do have more questions, you are welcome to send them through to myself or to Rudolph. I can see on his shared screen has got his email address. So this doesn't have to be the end, I promise. Anyway, so Francois asked, where does the current online submission systems fit into the future approval system?
We're still far apart. As I said, Cape Town has got their own system. In fact, the Western Cape has got a different system working on SAP, so they're moving and doing their own thing down there. Joburg has used the World Bank system, and those are the only. A couple of smaller local authorities are using, you won't believe me, Windows products to try and give some sort of electronic system. They are so far behind is that our envisaged scrutinizing system, I'm not seeing as being part of the electronic systems in the local authority at this stage. They cannot work parallel because there is no systems in 90% or 99% of local authorities in South Africa. So we need to create a system which is driven more by the private sector, more by the architectural profession themselves, as a service to be provided to their clients at cost, at additional, so that that assists the local authorities. And the way that we envisage seeing it at this stage is through a competent person process, registering with the local authority and allowing the local authority to recognize your system and the process that you're using as acceptable to them, and then they will then allow it to happen.
Okay. And last question from Francois. How can we get involved with this work to help change the process?
Brilliant. The first item should be is that the BIM Society, there's a Vaughan Harris that we've had discussions with in the past, and they started talking about getting a team together. And remember what I explained with the development of SANS 10400, those committees of industry specialists sitting there developing the documents to satisfy the law. As I said, Regulation C talks about dimensions and drawings. So it makes logical sense that we can slot into that a BIM process. And with the BIM process being explained, we can then from that start doing a self-certification process within that section. So my suggestion would be is that you formally organize yourselves. We'll of course assist, but formally organize yourselves and request such a specialist committee being established by the SABS so that you can start working on a document like that. Start looking at international processes, start using those documents, bringing them in, and start refining them for a South African solution. And once we've got that, we can then escalate that up to the TC60 as a requirement that needs to be met. And we've got our foot in the door to move forward.
Okay, great. Yeah, look, I know a fair amount about Vaughan, Mr. Vaughan Harris, who used to work at the BIM Institute. I think there was another let's say group of like-minded people from the AEC industry that are interested in working towards something relating to the ISO 9650 standards and getting them incorporated as a national annexure. For anybody that's wanting to get more involved in that, you're welcome to make contact with me. And I'll put you in contact with the people that are administrators of that group. I do know that they are working on it, and they have been speaking to, I don't know if it was at the technical committee, but there was a subcommittee at national level. But how close they are, I don't know. But yeah, anyway, guys, we have run over the time, and while we could keep going forever and ever, I do need to cut it short. So yeah, the last thing I do need to say is thanks so much for everybody attending, and thank you to Rudolph for making time to deliver this presentation. I'm sure many of our attendees gained a lot of insight from your session.
I thank you as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. That's everything on my side, guys. See you next month. Have a good holiday.